tell us who you are and a little bit about yourself.
I'm Stephen Bullick. I'm 68 years old. Grew up and lived in McCandless for the major portion of my life. And I happen to be Joe Bullick's son, who's responsible for this collection that makes up the majority, some of the materials that are here at the Heritage Center.
Wonderful. Tell us who was Joe, and give us a little bit of information about that.
My dad has an interesting history in that he was the product of a single mother during the Depressions, who, because of that time period, single parent, especially a female, was not able to take custody and raise a child. So my dad, through the court system, ended up at the farm down on Old Perry Highway with the Fitzpatrick family. I will say that his mother, who became a domestic servant in certain places, stayed in contact and was with my dad through visitation and contact with him his whole childhood through that time period. So he lived in Old Perry Highway, and the Fitzpatricks, Harry Fitzpatrick was, as was his father, was the blacksmith in this region. And so my dad grew up in that household with Mrs. Fitzpatrick and also Harry Fitzpatrick, who also boarded horses there at that location as well. That was before they built McKnight Road, which kind of took some of their property, and that's a different part of the story. My father stayed there until he was 10, and then my grandmother was dating a coal miner from Wildwood, and so they eventually got married, and they were married, and that officially changed my dad's name from Joseph Evans, which was Yvonne, which was Slovak. She was Slovak, and her story is a fascinating story in its own in the family. But my dad, for the first time, was going to be a part of a nuclear family. So they had an apartment down on the north side, down in Deutschtown. That's where one of his aunts lived with her husband. So he was in close proximity to my Aunt Mary. And what happened 6 weeks after they were married, and that's where my dad's last name came from with the adoption. George Bullick was Croatian, came over when he was 10 years old to work in the mines with his brother and his father. 6 weeks after the marriage and stuff, my grandmother, in the story as it goes, wasn't feeling real well, didn't feel well. This was 1940, and she ended up going into Allegheny General Hospital. As it turned out, she had pneumonia, and it acted very quickly, and within 24 to 48 hours, she had passed. So now my dad was in a situation again where he was with a new stepfather who he didn't know that well, although Grandpa Bullick was very good to them during the courtship and everything else. And the court looked at that situation and didn't know exactly how to deal with that. My dad and George Bullick ended up coming back out to the Wexford area and boarded in the house on Old Perry Highway. It was closer to my Grandpa Bullick's work at Wildwood. My dad was back then in the elementary school at Ingomar Elementary, where he had gone to school. And then what transpired, according to the story, is that Grandpa Bullick and Harry Fitzpatrick got in a disagreement over something minor, but it was a disagreement nonetheless. So Grandpa Bullick moved out for a period of time because he was upset, and actually moved in with Henry Fitzpatrick's sister, Mary Foy, who was a widow, who lived down, presently it would be down towards the intersection where Pine Creek crosses over 19. There were houses and other things before, of course, McKnight Road and everything was built. And he started to board there and still stayed in my dad's life. Never did move back, and then the court eventually gave not custody but protectiveship to the Fitzpatricks again. So my dad lived there, and then Grandpa Bullick never remarried and was always a part of our life. He eventually, when the road came through, McKnight Road came through, Mrs. Foy bought a little house out in Warrendale, and my grandfather went out and stayed with her at that, and then when she passed, he eventually owns the house. It's the same house that my sister owns. My sister was named after my grandmother, and so my grandfather, Grandpa Bullick, had a very close relationship with my sister. So in the will, she ended up receiving the house. It's out in Warrendale, out in Northgate. So my dad was thrust once again back into being a ward of the court at the Fitzpatricks, and that's where he lived. Well, the story goes on, that's where he lived until after he graduated from high school. He met my mother at high school, because you have to remember that the elementaries out here didn't have a high school, and so he went to Westview High School.
Okay.
My mother's family originally was from Indiana County, but my grandparents moved to the North Hills area because he was involved with the railroad post office and the postal service. So they had a home in Laurel Gardens on top of the hill from Westview. So my parents met in high school. My dad, Ben, who was a very good athlete but didn't get an opportunity to play high school sports because of working with the Fitzpatricks, and also he worked on the weekends parking cars at the Sportsman's Club, which is down the street from here. Through high school, he would park cars down there and had some other businesses, that wall washing businesses and things that he was involved in. Had an opportunity to go to Florida with the Washington Senators organization, and it was more of a school and a camp, a little like instructional leagues now. So he went to Florida and had an opportunity to play down there for a period of time. Met his best friend, became his best friend for life, who was from Nannyglow originally, but then had settled in New York after he exited out of the Marines with World War II. And that's who I'm named after. Steve Hudak was named after him. It became apparent that neither one of them were going to get big contracts. And so they decided that it wasn't worth it. Steve went back to New York. He came back to McCandless and to Wexford. And then him and my mother were married in 1952 in the fall. And so as they were married, they needed a place to live. It was the same time that Mrs. Fitzpatrick and her mother was living with them at that time period as well, in the farmhouse. The farmhouse only had 2 bedrooms upstairs, and so she got money off of the state when they built McKnight Road because it took a portion of her property. So her property would have extended from Old Perry Highway all the way down to where Vestal Field would be located. So she sold that property and used a portion of that money in order to put on upstairs, put a powder room in, a kitchen, and another room that took the attic and turned it into a living room. So that's where my parents moved in when they were married, and then I was born in late spring of the following year. So we lived there, and then my sister followed a year and a half later in that little 4-room apartment upstairs with a powder room. There was 1 bath on the first floor and then a shower in the basement. So I remember the old house well growing up into that, and that's where we lived for 13 years until we bought the other house out in Wexford. Mrs. Fitzpatrick and her brother, who moved in, as well as her mother, lived in the downstairs. There were kitchen, living room, bedroom and a full bath on that floor. He slept on a cot in there and worked at the golf course, actually down as a bartender and handyman that time.
North Fork Golf Course?
No, the one that down in, if you know where the theater is and stuff, there was a golf course there at one time. Yeah, there's still pieces of it left. I can show you where there's still a par 3 that you can make out on that course that's still there if you pull in the entrance and stuff of the old theater. It was Twin Oaks, I think. I'm trying to remember the name. That's terrible, but I know there's cards here and stuff, but it's escaping me right now. As it was then, when I graduated from college, I had been independent, only coming home on weekends occasionally and also during the summer. So I received my first contract and a job because I was in education at NA. That would have been in the fall of '75. And so I wanted to become, I had been independent. So we called her Grandma Fitzpatrick. Mrs. Fitzpatrick was running the upstairs apartment out and it wasn't going real well. So my dad basically said, "You'll move down with Grandma Fitzpatrick." So I moved to the old house again where I had lived for 13 years and lived there until 1985. So from 75 to 85, had the upstairs apartment, and then I had a shower in the basement, and it gave me an opportunity to help her out. Her mother then passed, and also then her brother passed. And so it gave her a source of income. It was a good location within the district where it was at, but it was my dad's sense of responsibility because of all she had done to kind of pay back by living down there. So I lived down there for 11 years until I was married. That kind of gives you more than enough background.
Yeah, great. And now Joe worked for North Allegheny himself, right?
My dad, when he came back from Florida, actually worked for Otto Helm, who was a block player. And Dad was part of the crew that built most of the foundations for the Longview plan, which is across from North Allegheny Intermediate, which was the original high school. The contractor for the Longview estates and other estates, this area was building up in the 1950s with those single family homes. And so Dad was a mixed mud, laid blocks and other things that throw up 2 foundations a day, actually. It was a pretty efficient operation. When I was probably about 2 or 3, 2.5, my dad actually got rheumatic fever from that because it was so stressful. The other thing that you would have to remember, the block laying at that time and that type of work was seasonal. So that when Dad wasn't laying blocks, he was unemployed. So he worked for the state, throwing cinders and stuff and other things, odd jobs during the winter. My mother was a bookkeeper and kept the books down at Swarmer's Restaurant Supplies, which was just down the street in an office building. The building's still there. I don't know what it's utilized for now, right down from the old house in Old Perry. So my dad fortunately recovered from the rheumatic fever and didn't leave any scars or any problems with his heart, but they looked for other options. And a good friend of his who had lived close to him growing up down there were looking for custodial help, and made my dad the offer to go up to Ingomar Elementary as the custodian in that. I still remember the discussions about that somewhat, even as a very young kid, because of course it was less money. He had some other options to go down to the mills down in the Ohio Valley or someplace and make more money, but he knew that it was going to give him some health benefits, and also it was going to give him a secure income and a secure position. So he moved back, started work in the elementary building that he actually went to school in, and then it went through some transitions because they built a new wing on that. They did some other things, and as we mentioned in sidebars earlier, Dad was there all the time, because at that time you didn't have second shift custodians, so that he would be working evenings when there were meetings, PTAs, garden clubs, on the weekends when there were things. So oftentimes, even as a young boy, I would accompany him and have to carry chairs out to set up and do other things, help him with the scrubbing of the floors and things of that nature. But he became kind of the caretaker for the whole faculty that was up there in the community of Ingomar, where he had grown up. It led to, I should mention that he became very close friends when he was in grade school with the Reineman family that are on the other side of where he grew up on Reineman Road. The Reinemans are a very old family in this area who got their land through the depreciation land grant because of their participation in the American Revolution. So Reinemans were hardworking farm families and stuff, and my dad kind of bonded with them, and the story goes that protected them and fought on their side when people would be teasing them about their lack of clothes and things of that nature. So he became an honorary Reineman, still attending their reunions and everything else. But the Reinemans, Bud Reineman, who died a while ago, and Ernest Reineman, both laid blocks. And so on weekends and other times, my dad would work laying blocks for them. They would put on, foundations for extensions on homes or garages or small businesses that were building. So Dad on the weekends was block laying as well. I should mention too that my dad never quit playing ball. He played baseball until he was in his mid-20s or late 20s in the Butler Eagle League, the same league that I played in when I came out of high school and stuff, because you needed to play ball there. I also, I know I'm going in a different direction, but growing up where we did on Old Perry, it's right across from out our window, small window in the family room or in the living room, you could see Vestal Field. So at a very early age, because there was an open vacant lot then and just the ball field at Vestal, I hung out at Vestal for the most part almost every night in the summer, because my mom would watch me cross over McKnight and then across the piece of the McKnight Road and then down the hill. And so I would take care of the pop machine or the score machine or do a pickup game there. My dad was working constantly, doing all kinds of stuff, and my dad was really not involved as a Little League father at all. He had all of his stuff that he did. So I was over there and played baseball at that field, as well as the field that was over in Franklin Park in the Ingomar Baseball League, and then went on and played Colt League, high school and college and stuff of that nature, and played in the Butler Eagle League. But the ironic thing is my dad never saw me play, right? Because he was never around for that. He eventually ended up being the manager of Warrendale's team in the Butler Eagle League, where he had played when I got out of high school and had to play in college. The difficult part was that was the closest place for me to play, but a good friend of mine, because I played against him and knew him in other retrospects, his family, his dad had been the athletic director at Westview High School, Marty Martorelli and stuff. My dad, I couldn't play for my dad because Pete was catching at Pitt, I was catching at IUP, so one of us would have to go out to the pasture. So I ended up, my dad didn't want me on the team, so I ended up at Middle Lancaster, which is up above Zilly, which was the major competitor against Warrendale. So I played against my dad.
Who had the better record?
Actually, it was kind of even. Okay. The two of us, and also there was a team called Highfield, which is up in Lindora, were the three main teams in that league. And so Middle Lancaster was an interesting trek up there all the time, but the person that owned the field, a little farm field, recruited not only me, but people from Beaver Falls and from other places, and a bunch of guys that worked on the power lines for West Penn who were just phenomenal ball players. So it was real interesting playing constantly against my dad. And so, but you know, I hung out at the Little League field all the time growing up and stuff. But I think it's just because Dad, I segued into that because Dad was laying blocks all the time. And I would help at times, but very early in my life, I realized that they don't put the 12s where you want the 12s when you're laying a foundation. And both him and Deacon Reineman, that was Ernest Reineman, would grunt, and they'd want more mud, more blocks to throw them up. So as 11 and 12 and 13-year-old, laboring for them was not the most fun. So that my dad kind of said, do you want to do this the rest of your life? And I said, no, not really, but I don't mind the work. But it got to the point where they continued to lay blocks and stuff. And we did all kinds of other painting and work that my dad would find. But that's how I was able to stockpile my money for my college. So my dad didn't pay for college, but he provided me plenty of opportunities to work. Some that was unpaid, and some that I made a little bit of money off of. So, but yeah, Dad continued at NA, and then when Dr. Newman, who the stadium of course is named after, came in as the new superintendent, Dr. Newman started to tour the facilities and the buildings. And as he toured Ingomar Elementary, he saw how clean it was, how well it was maintained, the work ethic that my dad happened to have. And so he wanted that same type of level of consistency through all of the buildings. And so he offered my dad a position to be superintendent of cleaning, which sounds fancy. But it just meant that he was a head custodian over all the custodians in the cleaning process. And so that really is something that my dad embraced because it was more, my dad's whole life, it was not, and I think he passed that on to me, it was not the monetary reward, it was about a job well done and having the esteem in what you do and the pride in what you do. So he took over that position, which really created the fact that if you know about the size of a district, that meant that there were 3 shifts that he was responsible for. So it was moving all of those individuals around and making sure that you had personnel and making sure that everything was getting done through high school. That was the time period, and you probably have seen those machines now that are quite small that are automatic scrubbing machines. My dad was always in the forefront of trying to get the best technology, and North Allegheny was willing to do that if it was cost savings and provided a better product. We had Clark machines. So the Clark machine was a battery-driven scrubbing machine, weighed a ton because of the batteries and the everything that was in it. But he had a rotating crew that would scrub classrooms and stuff during the week in the evening. Every Sunday, besides all the other work that I described that we would do in the afternoon, we would move the machine to another facility, to another building. He had them build a ramp, and he had a Dodge van with the motor in the middle, but the machine fit into that. So we had to push it up the ramp and push it in, take it to the next location and put it on charge. So my dad's work was 24/7 all the time. And that's kind of, he instilled that in me, I guess, at times as well.
So when did Joe begin collecting items for the museum, and yeah, how did all that come about?
The museum was a situation where, as I continued to teach at NA, I came into contact with other educators because of my role in both education committees as well as the state organization. And one of those happened to be from Plum School District, who had a unique course in oral history, who was in the process where his students would record oral histories from the community of people in that community, leaders, farmers, people that had lived there, families that had lived there. I mentioned that to my dad and thought that with his connections, because being raised by the blacksmith in the Wexford area, my dad knew all of the farm families and all of the people that lived there, because it's one of the things that we talked about as well, is that as North Allegheny continued to grow and the community continued to transition with new people coming in, the history of the location might get lost as far as what that was. And one of the simple aspects of that is that most of the roads in McCandless are named after the farms and the families that lived on those roads. Yeah. And so my dad knew those families, and so we started to talk about doing some oral histories. And so my dad started to interview individuals, which he enjoyed doing, because if anybody knows my dad, he loved to talk and loved to tell stories, and these people were telling their stories. We did get some support, and he always got support from the district to do some of that, also from the local state politicians in order to get some seed money for some of the things that he was doing. And as he did that, what happened was he started to get families who didn't know what to do with the pictures that they had, some of the artifacts that they had, and so they started to turn those over to Dad. So we talked about that before I had transitioned from North Allegheny to Mount Lebanon and into an administrative role, about finding a place to collect that history and keep that history. He was fortunate because he had a string of superintendents that were in place that were very supportive of that. And so they ended up finding the location that my dad could use to house that and to put that in place. Within the field that I'm involved in social studies, there's a process in the elementary called Expanding Horizons, and part of that is dealing with the history of your community, usually in 2nd or 3rd grade. And so we thought that by building that and creating the artifacts and the knowledge, then that could be passed on to the students and used as a part of the curriculum. And then some of the high school students, especially in the TV production group and others, and in programs that might be a part of their IEP, could then interview individuals as well and put those and secure those. So that was the beginnings of the process. And then as word got out, it just kind of exploded. And as I said, my dad was never one not to take on other roles, and so he was doing that as the curator of the museum that he started. I should mention at the same time, Dad, because of his love of the sport, ended up coaching the 9th grade girls softball team. He ended up eventually coaching the girls golf team to a lot of success as well. Don't ask me why, but he ended up being the bowling coach for a period of time at NA. My dad wasn't a bowler. My dad was a fairly decent golfer, but my dad was a wonderful person to handle people. And so he was what a coach should be, and that is to get the best out of your people they're playing and give them ownership of that. So, Dad had the museum, and it just continued to grow and grow and grow. I left the area, didn't leave the area, but left my position at NA in '93 to take an administrative position at Mount Lebanon. So by that time, it was somewhat firmly established, and I continued to facilitate Dad with that, and then connected him to the History Center and other places for some resources so that we continue to grow. It transitioned from a place at Ingomar Elementary to a place at Ingomar Middle and the relocatables, to finally then McKnight Elementary in a couple different locations in the building. So eventually it became apparent that because of security reasons and because of the growth and the rooms that it gave, it wasn't going to work anymore. And my dad and I talked with his age, although he never acknowledged, what were we going to do with all of this and how would be best. And then we were very fortunate at the aspect of what the town of McCandless offered with its vision of having a heritage center and the history of not only McCandless, but the region, since the history of North Allegheny is so closely tied to the town of McCandless. And then the aspect of that collection coming here was kind of an easy transition. And then my dad, I think, made that transition very well, because the people here were wonderful in keeping him involved as being a part of this location, which I know he was very, very, very proud of.
Very good, yeah. And so he outgrew some of those rooms, and they had to find another place for this. Who was instrumental in helping it construct this building?
Well, Jerry Hoffman, who is part of the commissioners here, had taught at McKnight Elementary, knew my dad, as my dad knew most of the people that had been in A for a long period of time. And I think a part of that was a vision, as well as Toby, who was here as well. They saw the prospect of that. And it is, as the town builds its footprint with the facilities in the field and being more of a center point of the community. Dad and I always talked about that, because what you have with other communities, you have a main street and a town that oftentimes is the focal point of that community. In a suburban district, the thing that really unites people together oftentimes is the school district. And so with his history of the school district, he really had the history of this location, at least from the 1950s on, plus his knowledge of what transpired before that with the farm families and everything else, and the histories that he worked on for Pine Township, for Marshall, for McCandless, allowed for that growth to take place. So I think the town recognized that if it wanted to build identity as being the center point for this community, then it would be good to have the facilities that would establish that. And the Heritage Center here, the town building over there, the community days that then have become an annual event that are very well attended, it becomes a part of that whole progression to have the town as serving this community. And you're finding that similar to in other neighboring communities as well. I think as it transitions with more and more people coming into the area, especially in the suburban communities in the northern tier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna stop here for a second.
Yeah.